Carlotta froze as a heavy oak door clicked shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot over the hum of the espresso machine. As a maid, she was meant to be an invisible ghost in this Manhattan fortress, yet Grayson Rossi's towering silhouette now blocked her only escape. New York's most ruthless syndicate boss didn't yell about her crying at 3 a.m. Instead, he slowly rolled up the sleeves of his tailored shirt, his dark eyes locking instantly onto the violent, purple bruising blooming across her jawline. "I am going to ask you this exactly once," he murmured. "Who hurt you?" Carlotta Stone had perfected the art of being unnoticeable. In the sprawling, $30 million penthouse overlooking Central Park on Fifth Avenue, invisibility was not just preferred, it was an occupational requirement. She was 24, clad in the crisp, charcoal gray uniform mandated by the household, and she moved through the sprawling estate like a shadow. She dusted the first edition Hemingway novels in the library, polished the imported Venetian glass chandeliers, and scrubbed the imported Italian tile until her knuckles ached. She worked for Grayson Rossi. To the public, Grayson was a venture capitalist, a real estate magnate who owned half the commercial shipping ports from New York to New Jersey. To the people who whispered his name in the dark corners of the city, he was the heir and commanding architect of the most sophisticated organized crime syndicate on the eastern seaboard. He was a man of terrifying intellect and cold, calculated violence, though Carlotta had never seen him raise his voice. He commanded rooms with a whisper. He destroyed lives with a stroke of a Cartier fountain pen. Carlotta had taken the job out of pure desperation. 18 months prior, her mother had been diagnosed with aggressive stage 3 lymphoma. The treatments at Mount Sinai Hospital had quickly chewed through their meager savings, leaving Carlotta drowning in medical debt. When the legitimate banks turned her away, Carlotta had made the catastrophic mistake of borrowing money from Thomas Keegan. Keegan presented himself as an independent loan broker operating out of a sleek office in Astoria. In reality, he was a deeply corrupt YPD vice detective who ran a predatory lending ring on the side, targeting desperate, vulnerable women. He used his badge to terrorize his debtors, ensuring that if they failed to pay his exorbitant interest rates, they would face legal harassment, fabricated charges, or worse. For months, Carlotta had surrendered 80% of her generous salary from the Rossi estate directly to Keegan. But last week, her mother required an emergency blood transfusion. Carlotta had missed her payment by exactly 48 hours. The consequence of that delay was currently throbbing against the side of her face. It had happened that afternoon. Carlotta had been walking toward the 86th Street subway station, her coat pulled tight against the biting November wind, when an unmarked black Dodge Charger violently pulled up onto the curb, blocking her path. Keegan had stepped out, flashing his gold detective's shield to the few terrified pedestrians who dared to glance his way, effectively dispersing any potential witnesses. He had shoved Carlotta hard into the cold brick of an adjacent alleyway. "You think because you clean toilets for billionaires, you're untouchable, Carlotta?" Keegan had spat, his breath reeking of stale coffee and stale nicotine. When Carlotta had pleaded, offering him the small wad of cash she had scraped together, Keegan had backhanded her with the heavy silver ring he wore on his right hand. The impact had dropped her to her knees. He had then grabbed her by the throat, squeezing just enough to make her vision blur. "Friday. You bring me the remaining 4,000 on Friday, or I visit your mother in the oncology ward. I'm sure a sudden arrest for narcotics possession would do wonders for her blood pressure." Now, 12 hours later, Carlotta stood in the massive, darkened kitchen of the Rossi penthouse. The pain in her jaw was a blinding, radiating ache. The bruise had blossomed into a sickening palette of violet, black, and jaundiced yellow. She had managed to hide it during her evening shift by keeping her head bowed and letting her blonde hair fall like a curtain across her face. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a strict but aging woman, hadn't noticed. But Carlotta couldn't sleep. The tiny maid's quarters tucked away behind the laundry room felt suffocating. Panic had gripped her chest, a tightening vice that made it impossible to draw a full breath. She had crept out into the cavernous, silent penthouse, seeking the quiet sanctuary of the kitchen to wrap some ice in a dish towel. She stood by the stainless steel Sub-Zero freezer, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The tears were a mixture of physical agony and the crushing, hopeless realization that she was entirely trapped. She couldn't go to the police. Keegan was the police. She couldn't run. Her mother was tethered to a hospital bed. She was alone. She pressed the ice pack to her cheek, closing her eyes, letting the tears fall freely into the pristine porcelain sink. She was so consumed by her despair that she never heard the soft, deliberate footsteps approaching. She never heard the rustle of expensive fabric. She only heard the sudden, mechanical click of the heavy kitchen door locking. Carlotta gasped, spinning around so fast she dropped the ice pack. It hit the marble floor with a heavy thud, scattering half-melted cubes across the polished surface. Grayson Rossi stood by the door, his hand slowly falling away from the deadbolt. He was dressed down, though for Grayson, that still meant projecting an aura of intimidating wealth. He wore dark, tailored trousers and a long-sleeved charcoal dress shirt, the top two buttons undone, revealing a glimpse of a dark, intricate tattoo that crawled up his collarbone. He was 32, sharply handsome in a cruel, aristocratic way. His jawline looked as though it could cut glass, and his eyes, dark, fathomless, and usually entirely unreadable, were currently fixed on Carlotta with a predatory intensity. Carlotta's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She immediately lowered her head, instinctively letting her hair fall forward to shadow the right side of her face. "Mr. Rossi," she stammered, her voice thick and trembling. I apologize. I couldn't sleep. I was just getting some ice. I'll clean this up immediately and return to my quarters." She dropped to her knees, her hands shaking violently as she frantically began scooping up the slick, freezing ice cubes. She was breaking the cardinal rule: never disturb the employer. "Leave it," Grayson said. His voice wasn't loud. It never was. But it carried an absolute authority that demanded instant, unquestioning obedience. Carlotta froze, her wet hands hovering over the marble floor. "Stand up, Carlotta." He knew her name. The realization sent a fresh wave of shock through her system. He had never spoken directly to her in the 8 months she had worked there. To him, she was a uniform, a ghost who ensured his coffee was hot and his suits were pressed. Carlotta slowly pushed herself to her feet, keeping her chin tucked firmly to her chest. She clasped her trembling hands together in front of her apron. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered. Grayson didn't move from his position by the door, but the sheer weight of his presence seemed to fill the massive room, pressing in on her from all sides. He studied her for a long, agonizing moment. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. "Look at me," he commanded, his tone dropping an octave. Carlotta squeezed her eyes shut. "Please, Mr. Rossi, I'm very tired." "Carlotta." He took a single step forward. The sound of his leather shoe on the marble was a threat in itself. "Look at me." Terrified that he would fire her, terrified of losing the only income keeping her mother alive, Carlotta slowly, agonizingly lifted her head. She kept her eyes averted, staring fixedly at the expensive watch on his left wrist, but the harsh, recessed lighting of the kitchen illuminated her face completely. Grayson stopped. For a fraction of a second, Carlotta saw something shatter behind his dark eyes. The cool, calculating mask of the syndicate boss fractured, replaced by a flash of something so violently primal and destructive that Carlotta instinctively took a step back, hitting the edge of the granite counter. Grayson closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. Carlotta flinched, turning her head away, anticipating a blow. Instead, she felt the startling heat of his large, calloused hand gently hovering over her jaw. He didn't touch the bruise. He seemed acutely aware that even the lightest pressure would cause her pain. His long fingers hovered just millimeters from her skin, tracing the dark, violent edges of the contusion. The heat radiating from his hand made her shiver. "Who did this?" Grayson asked. The question was a low, terrifying murmur. It was the opening hook that ensnared her, the moment the atmosphere in the room irrevocably shifted. I fell," Carlotta lied, her voice cracking. "On the subway stairs. It was icy." "Do not insult my intelligence, Carlotta," Grayson interrupted smoothly. His gaze flicked from the bruise to her eyes, pinning her in place. "That is the imprint of a hand, specifically a heavy ring on the right index or middle finger. It was a backhand strike, delivered by a man significantly taller than you, with enough force to drop you to the pavement, given the secondary graze on your elbow." Carlotta stared at him, horrified and awestruck. He had deduced the entire violent encounter in less than 10 seconds of observation. "I ask you again," Grayson said, his hand slowly dropping from her face to rest on the counter beside her hip, effectively caging her against the island. "Who hurt you?" You can't get involved, Mr. Rossi," Carlotta pleaded, fresh tears spilling over her lashes. "Please, I just need this job. I just need to keep working." "I'm already involved," Grayson stated coldly. "You bleed in my home. You cry in my kitchen. You are my responsibility." "I'm just a maid." "You are under my roof," Grayson countered, his voice suddenly dropping to a deadly whisper. "And no one touches what is under my roof. Give me a name." Carlotta shook her head violently. "He's a police officer, a detective. If you do anything, he'll kill my mother. He told me he would. He'll frame her. He'll pull her from the hospital. A cop," Grayson mused, a slow, chilling smile curving the corners of his mouth. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth. It was the smile of a predator that had just spotted its prey. "Even better." "What is his name, Carlotta?" "Thomas Keegan," she sobbed, finally breaking under the immense pressure. The name felt like bile in her throat. "Detective Thomas Keegan. I owe him money. My mother. She's sick, and I couldn't get a loan, and he—" "Shh," Grayson commanded, his voice suddenly softening. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a spotless white linen handkerchief. In a gesture so shockingly intimate it made Carlotta's breath hitch, he gently dabbed the tears from her unbruised cheek. "How much do you owe this dead man?" Carlotta blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Dead man? How much, Carlotta?" $4,000. Grayson laughed. It was a dark, humorless sound. $4,000. He put his hands on you over $4,000. Grayson stepped back, the protective, suffocating cage of his body lifting, though his commanding presence remained. He pulled a sleek black cell phone from his trousers. "Mr. Rossi, please," Carlotta begged, stepping toward him. "You don't understand. He has a badge. He has the precinct behind him." Grayson paused, his thumb hovering over the screen of his phone. He looked at Carlotta, really looked at her, his expression hardening into something akin to carved granite. "Carlotta," Grayson said, his tone absolute. "By tomorrow sunrise, Thomas Keegan's badge will be nothing more than a piece of tin buried in the dirt alongside his teeth. Do you understand me?" Carlotta stood paralyzed in the kitchen as Grayson Rossi placed the phone to his ear. He didn't turn his back to her. He maintained eye contact, his gaze holding her anchored to the floor, while the world she knew violently tilted on its axis. "Dominic," Grayson said into the receiver. His voice was flat, corporate, entirely devoid of the murderous rage Carlotta had just witnessed a moment prior. "Wake up. I have a pest control issue." A pause. The voice on the other end was a faint, metallic buzz. "A Detective Thomas Keegan," Grayson continued, walking slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering, darkened expanse of Manhattan. "NYPD Vice, probably working out of the Queens sector. I want his entire life on my desk in 20 minutes. Where he sleeps, who he drinks with, where he hides his illicit cash." Another pause. "No," Grayson corrected softly, and the single syllable sent a deep chill straight to Carlotta's marrow. "We aren't buying him out. We are erasing him. And Dominic, send Dr. Harrison to the penthouse, immediately." He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the marble counter. He turned back to Carlotta, who was shaking visibly, her arms wrapped around her own torso. The reality of what she had just catalyzed was crashing over her in suffocating waves. She had read the tabloids. She had heard the whispered rumors among the household staff about the people who crossed the Rossi family, people who simply ceased to exist, their businesses absorbed, their bank accounts emptied, their bodies never found. "You didn't have to do that," Carlotta whispered, her voice trembling. "I could have found the money. I could have sold something." "You have nothing left to sell, Carlotta. And even if you did, men like Keegan do not stop. They feed on fear. They are parasites." Grayson walked back to her, moving with the terrifying, fluid grace of a large cat. "Come with me." He didn't wait for her to agree. He turned and walked out of the kitchen. Carlotta, driven by a mixture of deep-seated obedience and pure terror, followed him. He led her not back to the cramped maid's quarters, but down the expansive, art-lined hallway toward the east wing, his private domain, a place none of the staff were allowed to enter without explicit, prior permission. He pushed open a set of heavy double doors, leading her into a massive, opulent library. The walls were lined with dark mahogany bookshelves, the air smelling of expensive leather, old paper, and a faint hint of cedar. Grayson gestured to a large Chesterfield leather sofa near a cold fireplace. "Sit." Carlotta sat carefully on the edge of the cushion, feeling entirely out of place in her cheap, practical uniform amidst the multi-million-dollar decor. "Dr. Harrison will be here shortly to examine your jaw and ensure there are no hairline fractures," Grayson said, walking over to a crystal decanter resting on a side table. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy glass. He didn't offer her any, nor did he drink it himself. He simply held the glass, staring into the liquid as if for calculating a complex equation. "Mr. Rossi, Grayson," he corrected sharply, looking at her. "You will call me Grayson." Carlotta swallowed hard. "Grayson, what is going to happen?" "To you, nothing," Grayson said, his voice dropping into a soothing yet commanding cadence. "You will remain in this room until the doctor clears you. Tomorrow, you will go to Mount Sinai Hospital. You will find that your mother's medical bills have been completely zeroed out by a private, anonymous philanthropic trust. Furthermore, she will be transferred to a private suite on the VIP oncology floor." Carlotta's jaw dropped, a fresh wave of pain shooting through her bruised cheek. I can't accept that. I can never repay you. I am not a bank, Carlotta. I do not require repayment." Grayson set the glass down with a sharp clink. "As for your employment here, you are no longer a maid." Panic seized her again. "You're firing me," Please, Grayson, I am not firing you," he interrupted, running a hand through his dark hair, the first sign of agitation he had shown all night. "You will not scrub my floors or clean my toilets. Mrs. Gable will be informed that you have been promoted to a private administrative assistant. Your salary will be tripled. You will have a suite in the guest wing. You will never set foot on the subway again. A driver will be assigned to you." Carlotta was dizzy. The whiplash of the last 30 minutes was too much for her exhausted mind to process. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why are you doing this for me? I am nobody." Grayson looked at her, his eyes tracing the vulnerable line of her neck, the horrific bruise on her face, and the desperate, exhausted resilience in her eyes. He walked over to the sofa and crouched down in front of her, bringing himself to her eye level. The proximity was intoxicating and terrifying. She could smell his cologne, something expensive, smelling of bergamot and smoke. "Because in this city, Carlotta, power is absolute," Grayson said softly, his gaze burning into hers. "Men like Keegan abuse their meager sliver of power because they think there are no monsters bigger than them hiding in the dark. They think they own the shadows." He reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly against the uninjured side of her face. "I am the monster in the dark," Grayson whispered, a chilling promise laced with an undeniable dark protection. "And I am going to remind Detective Keegan exactly who owns this city." The heavy mahogany door of the library opened, and a distinguished grey-haired man carrying a black leather medical bag stepped in. Dr. Aris Harrison didn't ask questions. He didn't look surprised to see a battered maid sitting in the syndicate boss's private sanctuary. He simply nodded at Grayson and approached Carlotta. As the doctor began his careful examination, Grayson's phone vibrated. He answered it, stepping away toward the towering windows. Carlotta watched him, wincing as the doctor pressed gently against her cheekbone. "Speak," Grayson ordered into the phone. It was Dominic. The intel had been gathered. "He's currently at a clandestine poker game in the basement of a meat-packing warehouse in the Bronx," Grayson repeated, his voice echoing coldly in the vast library. He glanced back at Carlotta, his eyes dark and empty of all mercy. "Take 6 men. Secure the perimeter. Do not kill him. I want him breathing when I get there. He needs to understand exactly why his life is ending." Grayson hung up the phone. He looked at Carlotta, giving her a single, definitive nod. The invisible girl was no longer invisible, and the man who had hurt her was about to find out that the bill had finally come due, collected by the devil himself. The guest wing of the Rossi penthouse was an entirely different universe from the cramped, windowless quarters Carlotta had occupied for the last 8 months. Mrs. Gable, the stoic head housekeeper, had escorted Carlotta there shortly after Dr. Harrison finished his examination. For the first time, Mrs. Gable's unflappable professional mask had slipped. She had looked at Carlotta, bruised, shaken, wearing her standard-issue uniform, and then at the sprawling, silk-draped canopy bed of the VIP suite, her eyes wide with unasked questions. But in the Rossi household, survival meant keeping your mouth shut. "Your new uniforms will be disposed of, Miss Stone," Mrs. Gable had said tightly, leaving a silk nightgown at the edge of the bed. "Mr. Rossi has arranged for a personal shopper to arrive at 9 tomorrow morning. Good night." Carlotta barely slept. The silk sheets felt foreign and dangerously slippery against her skin. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the terrifying, hollow emptiness in Grayson's dark eyes when he spoke of Thomas Keegan. She had traded one monster for another, only this one was infinitely more powerful and wore bespoke Italian suits. By 10 the next morning, Carlotta's world had completely transformed. A polite, sharply dressed woman had arrived with racks of tailored slacks, silk blouses, and cashmere sweaters, discarding Carlotta's cheap, sensible clothes without a second thought. An hour later, a towering security guard named Leo, who moved with the silent, heavy grace of a heavyweight boxer, escorted her down to the private subterranean garage. A sleek, black Maybach was waiting. "Good morning, Miss Stone," Leo rumbled, opening the rear door. "Mr. Rossi instructed me to take you directly to Mount Sinai." The drive up Madison Avenue was a blur. Carlotta sat in the plush leather seat, her hands trembling in her lap. When she finally reached the oncology ward, the stern, overworked nurses at the front desk practically tripped over themselves when Carlotta gave her mother's name. "Ah, Mrs. Stone," the head nurse said, her tone dripping with newfound deference. She was transferred to the penthouse recovery suites on the top floor late last night. Floor 12. You have private elevator access at the end of the hall. Carlotta stepped out onto the 12th floor and felt her breath catch. It didn't look like a hospital. It looked like a luxury hotel. Soft, warm lighting replaced the harsh fluorescence. The scent of fresh lilies masked the usual antiseptic hospital smell. She pushed open the heavy oak door to room 1204 and found her mother sitting up in a motorized, state-of-the-art bed, looking out over a breathtaking view of the East River. Sarah Stone looked frail, her skin pale and her hair thinning from the aggressive chemotherapy. But for the first time in months, there was a faint, hopeful color in her cheeks. "Carlotta?" Sarah whispered, turning toward the door. Her eyes widened as she took in her daughter's elegant new clothes, but then zeroed in on the dark bruise covering her jaw. "Oh, my sweet girl. What happened to your face?" Carlotta hurried to the bedside, gently grasping her mother's thin hands. "I'm clumsy, Mum. I tripped on the subway stairs. It looks worse than it is." She forced a bright, reassuring smile. "But look at this place. How are you feeling?" Sarah shook her head in absolute bewilderment. "I don't understand it, Carlotta. The administrator came in at 4 in the morning. He said a private philanthropic foundation, the Archangel Trust, stepped in. They cleared the entire balance, everything. They even paid for the experimental immunotherapy trial I didn't qualify for. They said I don't have to worry about a single dime." Sarah squeezed Carlotta's hand, tears welling in her tired eyes. "It's a miracle. God sent us a miracle." Carlotta swallowed the thick knot of dread in her throat. It wasn't God who had intervened. It was the devil of Fifth Avenue. "It's a blessing, Mom," Carlotta lied softly, resting her forehead against her mother's knuckles. "You just focus on getting better." As Carlotta sat by the window, watching the city move below, the overwhelming reality of her situation settled over her like a heavy, velvet cloak. Grayson Rossi hadn't just saved her mother. He had irrevocably bound Carlotta to him. He had demonstrated that with a single phone call, he could manipulate the very fabric of her existence. He owned her now, far more completely than Thomas Keegan ever could have. And the most terrifying part of all was that Carlotta wasn't entirely sure she wanted to escape. 50 blocks north, in a damp, freezing meatpacking warehouse in the Bronx, Thomas Keegan was loudly demanding his rights. He was strapped tightly to a rusted metal chair, the thick nylon zip ties biting brutally into his wrists and ankles. The vast, cavernous room smelled of copper, stale ice, and old blood. A single, harsh halogen work light hung from the ceiling, illuminating Keegan and the 3 massive, silent men standing in the shadows. "You scumbags have no idea who you're messing with," Keegan spat, a line of bloody saliva dripping from his split lip. Dominic had hit him exactly once upon securing him, just to establish the baseline of the evening. "I'm NYPD. I'm a gold shield. When my precinct realizes I'm missing, they are going to tear this borough apart, brick by brick. Dominic, leaning casually against a metal support beam, slowly checked the face of his Rolex. He didn't say a word. He just waited. The heavy, corrugated metal door at the far end of the warehouse groaned open, protesting against its rusted tracks. The freezing wind howled through the gap, but the cold was nothing compared to the absolute, suffocating silence that fell over the room as Grayson Rossi walked in. He was dressed immaculately in a dark, double-breasted overcoat, leather gloves, and a silk scarf. He looked like he belonged at an opera at Lincoln Center, not in an abandoned slaughterhouse. His footsteps echoed sharply against the concrete floor as he walked into the pool of harsh light. Keegan squinted against the glare, his arrogant sneer faltering slightly as he took in Grayson's cold, aristocratic features. "Who the hell are you?" Grayson stopped 5 feet from the chair. He slowly, methodically stripped off his leather gloves, handing them to Dominic without looking. "You are Detective Thomas Keegan. Badge number 8842. You run an extortion ring out of a fake loan office in Astoria. You target vulnerable women, primarily single mothers and daughters with sick dependents." Keegan swallowed hard, a sudden cold bead of sweat rolling down his spine despite the freezing temperature. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't," Grayson murmured, his voice deadly soft. He stepped closer. "Yesterday afternoon, you intercepted a young woman on 86th Street. You struck her across the face. You threatened to arrest her dying mother on fabricated narcotics charges if she did not produce $4,000 by Friday." Keegan's eyes darted frantically between Grayson and the silent men in the shadows. His mind raced, trying to connect the dots. "The maid? You're doing this over a maid? Look, buddy, whoever you are, I didn't know she belonged to a crew. I'll waive the debt. Consider it done. We're square." "Square," Grayson repeated the word as if it were a foreign concept. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a heavy, silver ring, the very ring Keegan had been wearing on his right hand just hours ago. Dominic had confiscated it during the apprehension. Grayson held the ring up to the light, turning it between his long fingers. "You struck her with this." "I was just scaring her," Keegan yelled, panic finally bleeding through his bravado. "It's just business." In a flash of movement so blindingly fast it defied his tailored appearance, Grayson struck. He backhanded Keegan across the jaw with the heavy silver ring clutched in his fist. The sickening crack of bone echoed through the warehouse. Keegan's head snapped violently to the side, and he let out a muffled, agonizing scream. The chair rocked but held firm. Grayson stood over him, his dark eyes entirely devoid of humanity. "That was for the insult to my intelligence," Keegan coughed, spitting a mixture of blood and a shattered molar onto the concrete. He was sobbing now, the pain blinding him. "She does not belong to a crew, Detective," Grayson said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute whisper. "She belongs to me. You put your filthy hands on a woman under my protection. You made her bleed in my city. You made her cry in my home." Grayson stepped back, tossing the bloody silver ring onto Keegan's lap. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his breast pocket and carefully wiped a single speck of blood from his knuckles. "Please," Keegan begged, his voice a wet, pathetic gargle. "I'll leave town. I'll resign. You'll never see me again." "I know," Grayson said softly. "Dominic." Dominic stepped forward from the shadows, retrieving a heavy, canvas roll bag from a nearby metal table. The metallic clinking from inside the bag was unmistakable. Grayson turned his back on the terrified detective and began walking toward the rusted metal door. He paused just before exiting, looking over his shoulder. "Take his right hand first," Grayson instructed Dominic, his tone as casual as if he were ordering a coffee. I want him to have a long time to think about exactly which fingers he used to hit her. And Dominic? Yes, boss? Make sure they never find the badge. Grayson stepped out into the freezing Bronx night, the heavy door sliding shut behind him, cutting off the sudden, piercing scream that erupted from within the warehouse. He climbed into the waiting armored SUV, his mind already leaving the blood and the cold behind. He had a debt to collect, but not in cash. He was thinking of blonde hair, terrified eyes, and the way Carlotta had looked at him in the kitchen. The invisible girl was finally in his line of sight, and Grayson Rossi never looked away from something he intended to keep. The transition from an invisible servant to the right hand of Manhattan's most dangerous predator did not happen overnight. But to Carlotta, it felt like being caught in a terrifying, exhilarating whirlwind. A month had passed since the night in the kitchen. True to his word, Grayson Rossi had erased every trace of her former life. She no longer wore polyester uniforms. She wore tailored silk blouses and sharp pencil skirts from Milan. She no longer took the subway. Leo, the towering wall of muscle acting as her personal driver and bodyguard, drove her in the armored Maybach. Her mother's health had miraculously stabilized. The VIP suite at Mount Sinai, the cutting-edge treatments, and the complete absence of financial terror had brought a vibrant color back to Sarah Stone's cheeks. Carlotta visited her every evening, always armed with fresh orchids and a rehearsed smile, carefully omitting the dark truth of exactly who was funding this miracle. As Grayson's administrative assistant, Carlotta's duties were complex and entirely confined to his legitimate enterprises, at least on paper. She organized his schedules for Rossi Real Estate Holdings, managed his philanthropic donations, and sat silently in the corner of massive, glass-walled boardrooms overlooking the city, taking meticulous notes. She watched him work. In the corporate world, Grayson was a shark disguised in bespoke Tom Ford suits. He dismantled rival companies with the same cold, calculated precision he had used to dismantle Detective Keegan. He never raised his voice. He commanded absolute, terrifying respect simply by breathing the air in the room. And yet, behind the closed mahogany doors of his private penthouse office, the dynamic shifted into something entirely different. Something that made Carlotta's pulse race and her mouth go dry. It was a rainy Tuesday evening. The sky above Central Park was a bruised, violent purple. Carlotta was standing by the massive mahogany desk, organizing a stack of shipping manifests, when Grayson walked in. He had just returned from a meeting in the meatpacking district. He smelled of cold rain, expensive tobacco, and a faint metallic tang that Carlotta had learned to ignore. He didn't go to his chair. He walked directly to where she stood, invading her personal space until the tips of his Italian leather shoes nearly brushed her heels. "You are working late," Grayson murmured. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated right through her chest. Carlotta swallowed hard, forcing her eyes to remain on the paperwork. "The shipping manifests from the Newark port needed reconciliation, Mr. Rossi. There was a discrepancy in the tonnage." "Grayson," he corrected smoothly, reaching out. His long, calloused fingers gently brushed a stray lock of blonde hair behind her ear. The touch was electric, sending a jolt of heat straight to her core. He only ever touched her like this when they were completely alone. Small, possessive gestures that staked a silent, absolute claim over her. "I told you, Carlotta. When the doors are closed, I am Grayson." "Grayson," she breathed, finally looking up into his fathomless dark eyes. "You found a discrepancy that 3 of my senior logistics managers missed," Grayson noted, his gaze dropping to her lips before rising back to her eyes. "You are proving to be entirely invaluable to me, Carlotta. But you are tired. The shadows under your eyes betray you. I want to be useful, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I owe you everything. Grayson's expression darkened. The gentle heat in his eyes was instantly replaced by a possessive, dangerous fire. He stepped closer, crowding her against the edge of the heavy desk. He placed a hand on either side of her hips, gripping the mahogany edge, caging her in completely. You owe me nothing, he stated, his tone absolute. Do not ever speak of debts between us. What is mine is yours. What I protect remains protected. Do you understand? Before Carlotta could answer, the heavy office door swung open. Dominic stepped in, his expression grim. He took one look at the intimate proximity between his boss and the former maid, and immediately averted his eyes, clearing his throat. Boss, we have a problem. Grayson didn't step back. He kept his eyes locked on Carlotta for another long, burning second before slowly turning his head toward his lieutenant. The romantic tension instantly evaporated, replaced by the suffocating, frigid aura of the syndicate boss. Report. It's Victor Moretti, Dominic said, stepping further into the room. He's been sniffing around the Queen's sector. Word on the street is he's looking into the sudden disappearance of a certain corrupt vice detective. Moretti used Keegan to move his illicit narcotics through the Port Authority. With Keegan gone, Moretti's supply chain is backed up. Grayson's jaw tightened. The Moretti family was an older, cruder syndicate operating out of Brooklyn. They were brutes, lacking the sophisticated corporate veneer of the Rossi organization, but they were vicious and possessed numbers. And, Grayson prompted, his voice dropping in temperature. And, Dominic hesitated, finally glancing at Carlotta. Moretti knows Keegan didn't just vanish. He knows we took him, and his rats in the police department told him that the day before Keegan disappeared, he assaulted a young woman matching Carlotta's description. Moretti is putting the pieces together, Grayson. He knows you have a new weakness. The temperature in the room plummeted. Carlotta felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. Grayson finally stepped away from her, his posture straightening into something rigid and lethal. I do not have weaknesses, Dominic. With respect, boss, Dominic countered quietly. Moretti RSVP'd to the Archangel Charity Gala tomorrow night. He's coming to our territory, and he's coming to look at her. Grayson turned his gaze back to Carlotta. The absolute, unyielding violence she had seen in the kitchen a month ago returned to his eyes. It wasn't directed at her, but the sheer force of it made her tremble. Cancel her attendance, Dominic suggested. Keep Carlotta in the penthouse, double the guard. No, Grayson said softly. The single syllable hung in the air like a guillotine blade. A terrifying, cruel smile curved his lips. If Victor Moretti wants to look at what belongs to me, I will give him a front row seat. Carlotta will attend the gala. She will stand by my side. And Moretti will learn exactly what happens to men who look too closely at the sun. The Archangel Charity Gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. It was a dizzying display of unimaginable wealth. Senators rubbed shoulders with tech billionaires, unaware that the elegant, soft-spoken host moving among them was the most lethal apex predator in the city. Carlotta stood beside Grayson, feeling like an imposter wrapped in a fortune. She wore a custom, floor-length gown of deep emerald silk that clung to her curves, paired with a diamond necklace that Grayson had personally clasped around her throat earlier that evening. The diamonds were heavy, a glittering collar that signaled to everyone in the room exactly who she belonged to. Grayson was a phantom of dark elegance in a tailored black tuxedo. He never left her side. His hand rested continuously on the small of her back, the heat of his palm searing through the thin silk of her gown. It was a protective barrier, but also a warning to every man in the room. Do not touch. Do not approach. An hour into the evening, the atmosphere shifted. Carlotta felt it before she saw it, a sudden, subtle parting of the crowd, a drop in the ambient chatter. Victor Moretti had arrived. He was a thick, barrel-chested man in his late 50s, his face flushed and pitted with acne scars. He wore a suit that was expensive, but flashy, lacking Grayson's refined taste. He walked with the swagger of a street thug, flanked by 3 enormous bodyguards who looked violently out of place among the socialites. Moretti's eyes scanned the room and instantly locked onto Grayson. Then they slid to Carlotta. A greasy, knowing smile spread across his face. Carlotta instinctively stepped closer to Grayson. She felt the muscles in Grayson's back coil tighter than a coiled spring, but his face remained a mask of polite, aristocratic boredom. "Grayson Rossi," Moretti boomed, extending a thick, calloused hand as he approached. "Beautiful event. Truly. Raising money for the sick. It warms the heart." Grayson did not take the offered hand. He simply looked at it, until Moretti, chuckling awkwardly, let it drop to his side. "Victor, I wasn't expecting you to venture this far past the Brooklyn Bridge." "I go where the business is," Moretti said, his eyes sliding shamelessly over Carlotta's emerald gown, lingering on the exposed skin of her collarbone. "And I hear your business is expanding, or should I say, diversifying." He took a step closer to Carlotta. "I don't believe we've been introduced, sweetheart. I'm Victor." Before Carlotta could speak, Grayson moved. It was a subtle shift in his stance, but he completely blocked Moretti's line of sight to Carlotta, putting his own body between them. "This is Miss Stone," Grayson said, his voice a deadly, quiet hum that barely carried over the string quartet playing in the background. "She is my personal assistant, and you are standing too close to her, Victor." Moretti laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Touchy, aren't we? It's just a friendly greeting. A man goes missing, say, a useful detective down in Queens, and suddenly everyone is on edge. Rumor has it, the detective had a bit of a temper, liked to slap around pretty little blondes who owed him money." Moretti leaned in, lowering his voice so only Grayson and Carlotta could hear. "You think you can take my logistics guy and I wouldn't find out why? You broke the truce, Rossi, over a maid." "There is no truce, Victor," Grayson whispered, leaning in to meet Moretti's gaze. The absolute, frigid emptiness in Grayson's eyes finally made the older mob boss falter. "There is only my city, and the rats that I allow to scurry in the gutters. You are a rat, Victor. Do not make the mistake of thinking you are a wolf." Grayson placed his hand flat against Moretti's chest and shoved him backward. It wasn't a violent strike, but it was an undeniable display of physical dominance. Moretti stumbled back a step, his face flushing a deep, furious crimson. His bodyguards instinctively reached into their jackets. Instantly, Dominic and 4 of Grayson's men materialized from the crowd, their own hands resting casually inside their tailored coats. The tension was a lit match hovering over a powder keg. Dozens of civilians were standing just feet away, oblivious to the fact that a gang war was seconds away from erupting in the plaza ballroom. "You're making a mistake, Rossi," Moretti spat, pointing a thick finger at Grayson. "She's a liability, and liabilities get people killed." "Leave," Grayson commanded, his voice slicing through the air, "before I have Dominic drag you out by your teeth." Moretti glared at Grayson, then shot one last, venomous look at Carlotta. "Watch your back, sweetheart. He can't protect you forever." With a sharp jerk of his head, Moretti turned and stormed out of the ballroom, his men trailing behind him. Grayson immediately turned to Carlotta. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his eyes scanning her face frantically. "Did he touch you?" "No," Carlotta breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "No, Grayson, I'm fine." "Dominic!" Grayson snapped without looking away from her. "Get the cars, we are leaving. Now." The ride back to the penthouse was agonizingly silent. Grayson stared out the window into the rainy night, his jaw clenched so tightly, Carlotta thought his teeth might shatter. The mask of the civilized businessman was gone. The ruthless syndicate boss had taken full control. When they reached the penthouse, Grayson bypassed his office and led Carlotta straight to the massive soundproofed library. He locked the heavy double doors behind them, the same metallic click that had trapped her in the kitchen a month ago. He walked over to the mahogany desk, pulled open a drawer, and tossed a thick manila envelope onto the leather surface. "What is this?" Carlotta asked, her voice trembling. "It is your way out," Grayson said, running a hand through his dark hair, looking more ragged and desperate than she had ever seen him. "There are 2 first-class tickets to Geneva in there, passports with new identities for you and your mother, a secure account number at a Swiss bank containing $10 million. Mount Sinai has an affiliate clinic in Switzerland. Her transfer has already been arranged." Carlotta stared at the envelope, as if it were a venomous snake. You're sending me away?" "Moretti is a dead man walking," Grayson said, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. He closed the distance between them, framing her face in his large, warm hands. "By tomorrow morning, the Moretti family will cease to exist. I am going to burn his entire empire to ash for daring to look at you. But it will be bloody, Carlotta. It will be a war. And I will not allow you to be caught in the crossfire. Grayson, I dragged you into the dark," he continued, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones, his eyes burning with a desperate, devastating affection. "I took a girl who was fighting to survive, and I painted a target on her back. Take the money, Carlotta. Take your mother. Go live in the light where you belong." Carlotta looked into the eyes of the monster who owned the city. She saw the blood on his hands, the violence in his past, and the terrifying depths of his power. But she also saw the man who had wiped her tears with a silk handkerchief, the man who had moved mountains to save her dying mother, the man who was currently offering to tear out his own heart just to keep her safe. She reached up, wrapping her smaller hands over his wrists. "I don't want the light," Carlotta whispered fiercely. She stepped closer, closing the final inch between them, pressing her chest against his. "The light is where men like Keegan get away with destroying lives. The light is where I was starving and terrified." Grayson's breath hitched. "Carlotta, you don't know what you're saying. You don't know what I am." "I know exactly what you are," she replied, her voice steady and absolute. She rose onto her tiptoes. "You are my monster, and I am not leaving." Grayson let out a ragged groan, the last remnants of his control shattering completely. He crushed his mouth against hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, consuming collision of possession and relief. He backed her up against the heavy mahogany desk, his hands tangling in her blonde hair, dragging her into the beautiful, terrifying darkness he ruled. Carlotta kissed him back with equal fervor, abandoning her fears, anchoring herself to the most dangerous man in New York. She had walked into his kitchen, a broken, invisible maid. She was leaving it as the untouchable queen of the Rossi syndicate, and God help any man who ever tried to make her cry again. The click of a locked kitchen door had been the catalyst that shattered Carlotta Stone's world, transforming her from an invisible, desperate servant into the beating heart of a criminal empire. What began as a terrifying encounter with the city's most ruthless predator evolved into an unshakable bond forged in blood, silk, and absolute loyalty. Grayson Rossi, a man who ruled in the shadows, found his singular vulnerability in a woman who refused to break. And Carlotta, once a victim of the light, found her ultimate sanctuary in the dark. By choosing to stand beside him, Carlotta did not just accept Grayson's protection. Tar embraced his power, rising from the ashes of her old life to become an untouchable force in her own right, forever bound to the monster who had saved her.